As-salamu alaykum. My peace, my siblings. Allah's mercy and blessings be upon you all. Today, I stand in front of you with sincere appreciation to the Almighty Allah for providing the chance to share with you a story that has greatly influenced how I perceive our faith and strengthened my belief in the strength of knowledge and critical thinking in the context of Islam. What I'm about. It is not a story intended for you to hear, to improve my standing or make that of others, but rather evidence of the significance of intellectual rigor, spiritual modesty, as well as the infinite quest to comprehend our lovely faith. Sisters and brothers, a lot of you might be familiar with Zakir Naik. He is now a well-known personality in current Islamic conversation, a eloquent speaker renowned for his proficiency in comparative religion, as well as his capacity to enthrall audiences across the Muslim world as well as other places. For decades, I had seen his talks, his participation in important Islamic conferences, and his extensive impact on social platforms for television and the media. Similar to, I had been impressed by his expression, his allusions to the Quran verses, and his ostensibly thorough answers to queries raised by both critics and viewers. I had no doubt that this was a scholar with extensive knowledge, sharp mind, as well as a love for defending Islam in the contemporary era. But my siblings, I have always thought that being awed by the popularity or eloquence of someone should never stop us from participating with them in terms of intellect and, in a spiritual sense. Peace, our Prophet Muhammad, be upon him, inspired us to look for information from any source, but, additionally, to confirm what we learn, to consider critically as well as to comprehend the bases on which assertions are based. This idea is what led me to a voyage that would result in an meeting I never would have imagined. The actual event was held at a significant Islamic conference, one of those magnificent events where thousands of Muslims, from various backgrounds, nationalities and philosophical traditions, assemble under one roof. The air was charged with spiritual vitality. There were lectures in several languages, conversations about a range of elements of Islamic law, theology as well as current affairs. It occurred during one of the primary sessions that I was seated in the audience as Zakir Naik performed on stage for what was promoted as a public forum in which he would respond to inquiries from the viewers. The meeting started as many of these sessions. Members of the audience raised their hands, were chosen by the organizers, and asked their inquiries. Some were simple questions regarding Islamic customs. Others were more intricate, addressing elements of Islamic theology or reactions to typical Western critiques of Islam. Viewpoints Zakir Naik reacted to, each with what seemed to be thorough responses laced with allusions to hadith and verses in the Quran. Customs. The audience appeared to pleased, even impressed, and there was consistent cheering during the proceedings. Then the time arrived when would alter the course of our communication. A young man that I subsequently discovered was a student at a university researching Islamic sciences got up and asked a query. His question concerned the notion of Islamic law and the manner in which Muslims ought to divergent academic viewpoints when making crucial choices. However, more in particular, he inquired as to how one ought to ascertain which academic viewpoint to adhere to when handling issues that have a direct influence on religious practice and spiritual status. He was curious to know fundamentally what approach a Muslim should use to separate fact from fiction when even renowned Islamic scholars disagreed on basic issues. Now this question is not new, brothers and sisters. This is a query that has been questioned by information seekers for centuries. However, the manner in which this pupil presented it, along with some implicit, the question contains criticism regarding the dependability of modern academics, appeared to capture Zakir Naik a little unexpected. There was a pause, a brief period of hesitation, seconds, but which was noticeable to those of us paying close attention. Then he replied with what I can only explain as a rather general response regarding the significance of adhering to established Islamic legal schools and relying on the expertise of qualified academics, but the response in my intellectual and professional evaluation was not complete. It didn't sufficiently deal with the main concern brought up by the pupil. It didn't struggle with the philosophical foundations for how a Muslim person should negotiate the terrain of academic dispute, especially when modern scholars occasionally appear to provide contradictory advice on issues of major significance. It was a response that fulfilled the surface level of the query, but failed to delve into its depth. I was thinking about this cautiously. I'm not a talkative man, impetuously or who actively seeks conflict for its own sake. I firmly believe in the Islamic precept of honoring knowledge and the people who have it. However, additionally, I think that when something is lacking or possibly deceptive, particularly when it comes to religious issues, it becomes our responsibility to provide elucidation and increased understanding. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said us that if we notice an issue, we should use our hands to change it if we possess the power to do so instead of using our tongues if we are unable to use our hands, and we ought to at least, in our hearts we detest it, as this usually hadith alludes to moral transgressions. The idea applies to intellectual and spiritual lucidity within our religion community. Following the end of the session, I headed to the meeting with the event planners. I conveyed my desire to speak with Zakir, not as a confrontation in public, but as a genuine interaction between those who were concerned about the truth portrayal of Islam. The planners were interested and set me up to go backstage and meet him. When we first met, I warmly and respectfully greeted him, for this is the Islamic way. I clarified that his words had touched me. Presentation, but I did have some reflections on the query that had been asked and the response that had been provided. I was given to Zakir Naik politely. He's not a cruel man, and he was open to having a conversation. I proceeded carefully and methodically. I started by recognizing the legitimacy of his focus on the traditional schools of Islamic law. This was totally accurate, and I confirmed this completely. But then I presented a more sophisticated framework for knowing the proper way for a Muslim to address the issue of conflicting academic viewpoints. I clarified that, while adhering to a recognized school of prudence on the part of jurists is advised, the process by which one ascertains which school to attend and how one handles circumstances where they're selected. The school may not have a definitive decision, needs a more advanced, more comprehension than his first response had proposed. I referenced the fundamentals of Islamic law, mentioning in particular Yale's works, Ibn Ta, Ghazali, and other classical academics who had struggled with exactly this query. The main thrust of my argument, this was it. Islam has given us fundamental ideas, the Quran, the Prophet's Sunnah, the agreement of academics, and the use of analogy. These are the instruments by which the foundation of Islamic law has been built. But using these tools has historically generated distinct findings from academics of comparable piety, wisdom, and intellectual ability. This is not a flaw in Islam, but instead an expression of the complexity of human situations and Islam's inherent adaptability. I maintain that when a Muslim comes across contradictory academic viewpoints, they shouldn't just wait to authority without comprehension. Instead, they ought to create a fundamental ability to assess arguments. They ought to comprehend the evidence being referenced, the approach being used, and the fundamental ideas involved. This method adheres to the idea of academic credibility while also enabling each Muslim to critically examine religious understanding. It establishes equilibrium between intellectual agency and humility, between adherence to custom and the bravery to reflect carefully on one's faith. Additionally, I mentioned that, although not totally, Zakir Naik's response incorrectly implied that a Muslim person is incapable of the authority to assess the arguments being created by academics. It displayed scholarship as a necessary component, approved in bulk as opposed to comprehended and discussed. This, I argued, was a minor but important deterioration of the Islamic concept that inspires all Muslims to look for knowledge and to apply the mental faculties that they are a gift from Allah. Additionally, I cited particular instances from Islamic history in which lay people participated in academic discussions and had made a significant contribution to religious conversation. The initial generations of Muslims, including numerous associates of the Prophet, lacked degrees from official establishments. However, they actively participated in theological and questions about the credentials of jurists. They were urge to do so. This is a component of our heritage. As I presented this case, I noticed a change in Zakir Naik's manner. He was paying close attention and he was clearly processing what I was stating. After I was done, there was a notable quiet. He did not do so right away, reply with a rebuttal or a rejection of my arguments. Rather, he thought for a moment and then admitted that my framework was more thorough than what he had shown. In his response, he even acknowledged that his answer to the pupil's query, but not wrong, but had been a little constrained in both breadth and depth. This instance of recognition was important, but because to me it was a victory over him, but because it showed the strength of a respectful, involved intellectual conversation among members of our religious community. Zakir Naik is a man who has knowledge or modesty, and he was prepared to determine when a point was properly captured. This is a sign of a genuine academic, the capacity to adapt one's comprehension and to develop in wisdom and knowledge. But what really got to me was that I had not meant for this backstage discussion to become known to the general public, but the organizers had other concepts. They had captured some of our conversation, and by the following day, word had proliferated during the conference regarding the conversation. The organizers started asking for a formal public meeting conversation on the platform where we had started. Although I didn't initiate it, I agreed, thinking that such a conversation might be advantageous for the conference's audience. The public meeting was planned for the next evening. The word had gotten out among those present, and I was informed that the main auditorium was packed with capacity, with thousands of people seated and waiting impatiently for our trade. The ambience was among real intellectual enthusiasm. This was not perceived as a conflict or a conflict of egos, but as a chance for two active thinkers to investigate an crucial query regarding how Muslims ought to be related to academic knowledge and power. As we stepped onto the stage, I was struck by the current state of slumber. Thousands of people watched us, and each word we exchanged would have weight for both those in attendance and those who would later learn about it. We exchanged cordial greetings, and the moderator, a well-known Islamic academic, himself, described the conditions of our conversation. We wouldn't be hostile, but would interact politely and in a meaningful way with the current query. I started by restating the query that had been photographed the day before and describing the reasons behind my feeling that the developed response was justified. Next, I displayed my framework in a more specifics, this time with the advantage of having thought about it all night and being able to hone my presentation. I discussed the Islamic epistemological principles, how Muslims learn and comprehend their belief. I talked about the function of personal assessment or ijtihad, and how this idea had historically utilized by both academics and lay people among Muslims. I created special focus on a Quranic, Zakir Naik's own principle, cited numerous times in his own lectures, the inspiration to reflect, to consider, to make use of reason, which Allah has given us. I quoted passages from the Quran that invoke believers to consider, research, and use their intelligence. So have they not traversed the planet and possessed ears by which to listen or hearts by which to reason, which to listen to? This is the Quran. Requirement for intellectual participation. I additionally addressed what I thought was a conflict in certain modern Islamic conversation. However, a lot of Muslim scholars and speakers stress the significance of adhering to established schools of legal prudence and honoring academic authority. However, these same speakers frequently rely on laypeople to comprehend complicated theological justifications and to support Islam is intellectually hostile to its detractors. How can we encourage Muslims to think more critically, evaluating Islam critically when facing outside critics while concurrently preventing them from thinking, evaluating internal scholarly matters? I thought this was a basic discrepancy that needed addressing. The audience paid close attention, quiet, taking in all that was said. I observed individuals who are taking notes. I noticed nods of consensus from different parts of the auditorium. However, I continued to concentrate on the argument's content instead, rather than the crowd's response. This is the standard for intellectual integrity, sought not for praise but for the truth. When it was Zakir Naik's turn to He answered in such a considerate manner. He did not make an effort to defend his prior response as being fully or completely sufficient. Rather, he interacted with my points outright. He admitted that the fundamental idea behind critical thinking is, in fact, fundamental to Islam. He gave in that his earlier reaction to perhaps the student's query had been too narrowly concentrated on the significance of following well-known schools without appropriately discussing the methodology which a Muslim could use to assess academic roles. But Zakir Naik made significant counterarguments as well. He highlighted the risks of excessive Islamic legal theory's emphasis on individualism, where each Muslim becomes their own mui, or a lawyer who lacks the required education or database of knowledge. He discussed the real-world repercussions of this type of fragmentation at which Muslims start to ignore recognized academic agreement in support of their own interpretations that cause chaos and disagreement that undermines the cohesion of the Muslim community. This was a important point, which I recognized as, like that. I then improved my stance to take into account his worries. I maintained that what I was promoting wasn't unrestricted independence or rejection of academic credibility. Instead, it was a more complex connection with understanding, one in which Muslims are urged to acquire a foundational skill in assessing claims while still acknowledging the significance of experts and reputable institutions of legal knowledge. There is no either-or choice proposition, but a framework that combines both. This was how the conversation went on. For more than an hour, we discussed and cited classical texts and examples from today. The voice was courteous and cooperative throughout, albeit rigorously intellectual. We were not attempting to humiliate one another or to show which of us was better. We were pursuing the admirable goal of gaining a deeper understanding of our faith and of elucidating crucial concepts for the people in the audience who are hearing us. As the session went on, something noteworthy occurred. The stage dynamic changed. Zakir Naik was less of a focus, defending his prior stance, and more about the two of us working together, examining the query collectively. When he realized I wasn't trying to diminish his standing or to depict considering him to be uninformed, he eased his defensive stance. He started to actually interact with the concepts being offered, and he even started to elaborate on my points, offering his personal observations and instances that enhanced the overall conversation. When we arrived at the end of the public discussion, Zakir Naik said something that would stay with me long after the event was over. I've paraphrased what he said because I wish to give his statements some fairness, that this type of intellectual activity, courteous, significant, and intent on clarity, not triumph, was precisely more of what the Muslim community needed. He admitted that my arguments had made him reevaluate some things of his method for responding to inquiries regarding Islamic law and the Muslims' individual roles in assessing academic roles. The response was remarkable. Initially, silence reigned as though people were analyzing what they had seen. Next, slowly, the applause started. It wasn't the cheers from those who had seen a triumph of one individual over another, but instead the cheers of those who had observed true intellectual conversation. Everyone got up. The cheers became more persistent and louder. I noticed some people's faces were crying. Participants, a few were holding each other, other talking about what they had heard. One elderly academic, a man with a lengthy, gray beard and obvious Islamic years, research engraved on his face, came up to me following the session concluded. In his 40 years, he claimed, as an Islamic scholar, he had hardly ever seen such a conversation. He informed me that the respect for one another and sincere participation that defined our conversation. He claimed that this is the way Islam scholarship ought to be carried out, with rigorously, respectfully, and with a sincere dedication to comprehension as opposed to winning debates. But what really got to me, most significantly, it wasn't the cheers or the compliments that came next. Instead, it was an encounter I had with a young lady who came up to me in the days after the incident. She clarified that she had been having trouble with her faith for a while. She had sensed that she was being introduced to Islam in a manner that required blind acceptance. She had experienced alienation from conversations that viewed inquiry as being on par with doubting. However, after seeing our conversation, after learning that it was able to interact critically with Islamic understanding while still preserving a high regard for scholarship and custom, she had experienced a feeling of freedom. According to her, our conversation had permitted her to reflect, to query, to have a deep conversation with her faith in a manner that respected her, both her spirituality and her intellect. This, siblings, is the real gauge of the importance of that conversation with Zakir Naik. It wasn't regarding one individual's inability to speak or losing. It had nothing to do with demonstrating superiority in intellect or acquiring prestige. It concerned elucidating a crucial idea regarding how Muslims ought to approach knowledge, how we ought to traverse the terrain of scholarly dispute, and how we can strike a balance between observance of tradition and the use of the intelligence that God has given us. As, even now, I think back on this experience, a passage from the Quran comes to mind, where Allah states, "And we haven't sent, as a courtesy to everyone, you worlds." This verse is applicable not only to peace be upon the Prophet Muhammad, but to everyone who possesses knowledge and give it to other people. Each of us is intended to be a kindness to those all around us. When we apply what we've learned to elucidate, lighten, and bring individuals who are more cognizant of Allah's message, we are achieving this goal. The evening came to an end with numerous queries from viewers, and a large number of those inquiries expanded on the clarity that had come out of our conversation regarding free will and predestination. Individuals were requesting more advanced follow-up inquiries since they now had a starting point for thought. This is the repercussions of genuine knowledge, shared with good intentions. Just a second of clarity can lead to countless moments of more profound comprehension. Finally, I wish to go back to my starting point. I learned from experience that in Islam, there is no competition for knowledge. It's a cooperation in the search for the truth. When we sincerely approach our faith hearts with humility and thought and with a strong dedication to comprehending, instead of winning, miraculous things can occur. Thousands of individuals walked out of that hall that night, not as though someone had won an argument, but with a more profound, lucid comprehension of one of the most significant facets of Islamic doctrine. Please pray for us all, brothers and sisters. Use this to approach our education. Same attitude. I hope we never turn into so devoted to our own comprehension that we are unable to learn from others. I offer up prayers that we never forget the goal of knowledge is to bring us nearer to Allah and to His truth. Additionally, I hope that we apply the knowledge we have acquired, fortunate enough to light the way for others, in order to provide clarity where there perplexity, and to bolster the faith of the Ummah. May we all be blessed by Allah with useful knowledge, with the discernment to use it appropriately, and with the humility to acknowledge that we are always pupils at the Dean's School. May Allah accept us all. Allah.